became enthusiastic as time went on, and that his fundamental interest is in the ontology of leadership, not just the descriptions of it, but the living and the being of leadership. And that's a terrific setup for the topic that he is presenting to us. I think you'll see the slide on the screen, the share screen, how leaders can avoid the trap of overinvesting in goal setting and underinvesting in action. We'll hear Kevin's presentation, and then we've asked Jill Murray and Fermina Scare to be the first respondents, and then we'll have a general discussion after that. So take it away, Kevin, and thanks again for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Roland, and thank you, Scott. I appreciate the opportunity to come and have a conversation today about goal humility. Where did that title come from? I've been processing these issues around goals for many years, and I think the first title I had was Goal Crazy. After that, it was Goal Frenzy. And I decided that really what I'm talking about here is goal humility. It's addressing the issues that we have as leaders when things become too focused on setting goals without maintaining the appropriate amount of attention and focus on actually engaging and enacting those goals. So you're going to see very few slides. I wanted to be sure that we left time for a better conversation. I am of the belief that sometimes we get trapped inside the PowerPoint and feel like that's how we have to talk about everything. Well, I don't want to do that. So one of the things I'm going to do is avoid jargon when talking about goal setting. So no KPIs, OKRs, you name it. There's plenty of those out there. I want to emphasize behavior. And so when we talk about leadership, it's really in three components of it. Knowing, there's a lot of stuff you need to know. Doing, there's a lot of things you need to do. But it's also about being. How do you show up as a leader, and how do you help those persons who are members of your team or followers to maintain their autonomy, increase mastery, in other words, get better at things over time, and to find purpose and meaning in what they do. I started by sending you all a vignette. And that vignette by my friend Jolene, I think captures a dilemma that so many people who are not necessarily at the entry of a career, but who have been in a job for a few years and suddenly find themselves in sort of an annual cycle of naming or enumerating goals, and then very little happens until the end of the year or the beginning of the next year when those goals are resurrected and there's a conversation about, well, did you implement them? A lot of times what I hear from folks is, what goals were those? And so often when those goals are amalgamated into a strategic plan, it becomes shelfware. And I think you're all familiar with that. There's a problem in setting goals. Organizations often overinvest in creating strategic plans that fail to consider the disruptions that are likely to occur. Well, you might not know what those disruptions will be, but there needs to be some accommodation that things are going to change over time. Too often at the organizational level, especially at the leadership level, there's overinvestment in setting goals and writing things down rather than maintaining and making sure that they're aligned with the mission and vision of the organization. So interestingly, I got earlier this week, I think it was, one of the McKinsey emails, and it was an interesting quote. It said, "The strongest CEOs are known for setting a bold vision for their organizations and mobilizing teams and stakeholders around it. And that comes from work by Carolyn Duvar, I believe is how you pronounce her name. She wrote a book called this CEO Executive Effectiveness, the 6 mindsets that distinguish between that distinguish between the best leaders and all of the rest of the leaders. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when you start studying who are the best CEOs, who are those best leaders, they do emphasize and keep alive mission and vision. Sometimes at organizations, there's a lack of systems thinking, and it becomes much more mechanistic, okay? The problem in planning and strategy is that sometimes they become very complex and convoluted. I think some of it, and this is my opinion, that the strategic planning industry has unduly influenced the process. And what happens is that a strategic plan, becomes the product rather than the blueprint of what you want to enact. And you get into this unfortunate cycling and recycling of repeating the same things over time. So when I work with organizations, one of the questions I ask, in fact, some people say this is the question I ask more often than any other, is what should you stop doing? Okay? In other words, rather than leaping to setting a goal, let's take a look at what we're already doing. We sometimes fall into a trap in goal setting because too often we find ourselves competing with one another, or teams competing to set priorities rather than thinking about the sequencing of events. What is the sequence of events that will give us the greatest yield? And when we fail to do that, that trap of priorities causes a high degree of conflict. Now, sometimes, unfortunately, that conflict is never fully articulated. And as a behavioral scientist and as a person with a background in psychiatry, oftentimes the best place to start with solving a problem is by clearly articulating it, okay? At the organizational, team, and individual levels, there are real challenges. The biggest problem that I see is that mission and vision are not clearly articulated. In fact, one of the examples I have is I was asked to work with a state agency, and that state agency had a new director who said, "We need to write a mission statement." And I said, "Well, wait, you're a state agency." "Yes, but we don't have a mission." I dug through the laws. I said, "Yes, you do. It's statutorily defined right here. Maybe you do have a mission, but what you really need is to articulate a vision." It's interesting that the research seems to indicate that articulating and frequently articulating a vision of the future improves resilience. There are also team conflicts, and I find this happens most often when they're focusing on whose priority is going to be the priority, rather than what is the appropriate sequence, okay? This is a place where leaders, especially executive leaders, need to enact and need to hold persons accountable in terms of a level of discipline so that they don't get sidetracked. What I find when I talk to people who are not in the leadership team, not in the management team, is that so often individuals find the process of setting goals to be obtuse and confusing. Okay? I talked to a group of people at one of the newer medical schools in the country. And I was asked to speak with their rank and file these were persons who were in classified positions. And they were having trouble developing professional development plans. Now, I said I wasn't going to use acronyms or stick to the jar, but this is one of the reasons that I brought this up. They said to me point blank, we don't understand this. We're not professionals. I mean, professional development, so for the doctors, yeah, we get that. And for the scientists, we get that. And for the ancillary medical staff, but mostly I schedule stuff and answer the phone. It was really interesting as I talked with them because, as Daniel Pink says in Drive, what they really want as employees is they want to do things the way they like to do them. They want autonomy. They want to get better at things, and they want to find purpose and meaning in what they're doing. When we started to use a phrase or to say, what if we improved your skills? What if we helped you to upskill? They understood that. Because we could say things like, what do you want to be able to do in 6 months that you can't do now? Oftentimes it related to different tools that they use, and they wanted to master the use of the right tools. So focusing on that upskilling and helping people get the right tools in the long run can help prevent this sort of wallowing or recycling of goal after goal after goal. So how do you enact goal humility? Well, if you're a leader, reiterate and emphasize mission, but also engage with members, other members of your organization, and not just the leadership team, by listening generously. What does listening generously mean? It means turning off your own internal dialogue and really hearing what they have to say. Ultimately, what you'll do is end up harvesting a vision that probably already exists in the organization. Your job as the leader, or our job as the leaders, is to articulate that in a manner that's succinct and understandable. If you go to the research and you look at, okay, what is the ideal number of goals? Over and over again, it's a small number. 2 to 5 is a pretty reasonable range. I have worked with strategic plans that have more than 80 goals. I haven't found those to be effective. In fact, I believe that one of those plans became probably the most significant shelfware I'd seen in a long time. The other thing that leaders can do is help to reinforce the idea that we want commitment to completing the goals. We want to share that, and we want to hold each other accountable. Okay? And that progress will be tracked in a timely manner. Okay? That demonstrates that completing goals has meaning. So here's another example. At one of the large academic health centers in this country, I have a very forward-looking dean. And once a quarter, he gathers the leadership team, which is essentially the associate deans, all of the department chairs, center and institute directors. Each of them has a small number of goals that relate to the mission and vision. And once a quarter, all of them get together, post their goals, and demonstrate, literally with metrics and measures, whether they've made progress to that goal or not. What's really interesting is that as time goes on, goals are deleted because they've been accomplished. That there's meaning behind it because those goals have been completed and something is different. So one of the places I think we should start in exercising goal humility is to focus on strategic thinking rather than on strategic planning. In other words, what is it what we're trying to do? How will we enact this vision? You can do this over a period of a few months, but it requires engaging in the appropriate sequence of events. So for example, talk about strategic thinking, emphasize the organizational mission, listen to those persons, meet with them, hear them, and begin to articulate a compelling vision. Oftentimes, this can occur in a leadership retreat. One of the biggest mistakes that I've seen over my career in strategy planning and goal setting is that oftentimes there is a push by the first tier of leadership to get the new leader or the leader to articulate that person's vision. If it's just that person's vision, it's probably not going to be enacted. It really has to be something that comes from the larger organization. If you can do that, then those teams and those individuals can begin to put together a coherent set of organizational goals. So that when Jolene comes up on the next year and it's time to look over whether she accomplished the goals during the previous year, that you can see whether she did, whether she didn't, and how much progress was made. But it also is a time to say, is this time to abandon goals? Strategic abandonment, is one of those things that's helpful. Why? I go back to my question of what should we stop doing? So part of the goal setting process is making decisions about what you're not going to do. Now, are you really making progress? Are you taking the time, and I don't mean the time by having an office of strategic planning that has a bunch of check boxes. I'm talking about engaging people in enacting the vision. At the same time, that's the only way you're going to be able to actively deal with the inevitable disruption that will occur. This morning I was reading about the top 10 academic health centers and the top 10 universities in terms of NIH R01 funding. Those organizations are doing great, but behind them there's another 10, 20, actually 150. And for many of them, their goal is to be in the top 10. I don't think it's going to happen because, for one thing, some of those in the top 10 will need to be dislodged. But wait a minute. Now we are experiencing disruption with this significant loss of federal research funding. Well, who is planning for that? My pitch to you is focus on a small number of larger organizational goals. What I've seen over time is that when you try to do more, you end up achieving and accomplishing less. one of those goals should also be related, or there should be organizational intelligence around what happens when those inevitable disruptions occur. If we exercise goal humility, if we focus on what is it that we really can do and really get done, I think we'll all be more successful, and I think we'll be much more efficient organizations. And with that, I will let the persons react to those, to my thoughts, and also if there are questions, we can move on to that. Thank you.